It is the breadbasket of the world. The American heartland, a symbol of agricultural might built on sun, soil, and sheer scale. But this entire empire, from the cornfields of Iowa to the wheat plains of Kansas, runs on a vital, unseen ingredient, a mineral that makes the soil fertile, sourced almost exclusively from the vast salt plains of a single Canadian province. In early 2025, a presidential tariff threatened to sever this critical supply line, but it also handed Canada a secret weapon, a silent lever of power over every farm in America. How did a trade war over taxes turn a simple fertilizer into a tool of geopolitical hardball? To understand the power of this secret weapon, you have to understand the silent pact that created it. For decades, the relationship was defined by a quiet, absolute dependency. The United States, with its vast agricultural empire, needed potash to make the soil productive. Canada, blessed with over a third of the world's reserves in the massive salt beds beneath Saskatchewan, had it in abundance. This created an unspoken agreement. Canada provided the essential nutrient, and America fed the world. It was a seamless, invisible artery, with an estimated 93% of all potash used in the U.S. flowing south from Canada. This relationship wasn't just convenient, it was foundational to America's status as a food superpower. But that quiet certainty began to erode under the America First doctrine. The Trump administration started to view all trade, even with its closest allies, through a lens of suspicion and competition. The idea that any dependency was a weakness took hold. The breaking point for this specific commodity arrived on February 1st, 2025. In a sweeping move, the White House announced its intent to impose a 25% tariff on most Canadian goods. While the initial focus was on other sectors, one item on the list sent a shockwave through the American heartland, a 10% tariff on Canadian potash. Though this was later modified after fierce lobbying from the U.S. Farm Belt, the damage was done. The move signaled that nothing was off the table. A critical resource, once seen as a shared continental asset, was now officially a pawn in a larger trade war. For the first time, American farmers were forced to confront the fragility of their most vital supply chain. And in Ottawa, a powerful realization began to dawn. If America was willing to weaponize trade, Canada held a weapon of its own, one that held the key to every harvest in America. The quiet pact was shattered on February 1st, 2025. In a sweeping display of economic force, the Trump administration announced its plan to impose a blanket 25% tariff on most goods imported from Canada. However, buried within the announcement was a seemingly minor concession, a lighter 10% tariff on strategic resources, including oil, gas, and, most critically, potash. This wasn't an act of mercy. As reported by DTN Progressive Farmer, this lower rate was the result of a frantic, behind-the-scenes lobbying effort by the powerful American farm bloc, who immediately recognized the catastrophic potential of a full-blown tariff on their most essential nutrient. They understood a truth that seemed to elude policymakers in Washington. You can't grow corn in Iowa without potash from Saskatchewan. But even the 10% tariff was enough to light a fire in the markets. The real damage wasn't the tax itself, which was set to take effect on April 4th, but the crippling uncertainty it unleashed. Before a single dollar of new tariffs was collected, the market priced in the chaos. The price of potash, which had been stable at around $303 per ton at the start of the year, skyrocketed. By the end of February, it had surged to $348 per ton, a nearly 15% increase driven purely by fear. Traders, suppliers, and farmers began hoarding supplies, anticipating logistical nightmares and future price hikes. The fear tax was real. Then, the situation escalated. Rumors began swirling out of Washington, later reported by Morningstar, of a potential second round of tariffs to be imposed by August 1st. This time, the threat was a full 35% tariff, aimed squarely at the very resources that had received the lighter initial treatment: potash and energy. The message was clear. The White House was not satisfied and was prepared to hold the American food supply hostage to achieve its goals. The strategy was to create so much pain and uncertainty that Canada would be forced to offer concessions on other trade fronts. But it fundamentally misjudged the nature of this specific dependency. It wasn't a matter of simple competition, it was a matter of geological destiny. And by targeting it, the administration wasn't just poking its neighbor, it was prodding a sleeping giant. Canada's response was a masterclass in geopolitical hardball, defined not by what it did, but by what it didn't do. There were no immediate retaliatory tariffs, no angry speeches condemning the move. Ottawa chose a path of strategic silence. They understood that in this specific fight, they held all the cards. The United States imports an astonishing 93% of the potash it consumes, and of that massive volume, nearly 90% comes from a single source, the vast, rich potash mines of Saskatchewan. This isn't just a trade relationship, it's a structural chokehold. With over a third of the entire planet's potash reserves, Canada didn't need to shout. It could simply whisper, and the American agricultural market would tremble. Instead of announcing a counter tariff or an export ban, actions that would have painted them as the aggressor, the Canadian government employed what analysts called weighted silence. They began to gently tighten the valve. There were no public orders, but American buyers suddenly found that delivery schedules were being subtly pushed back. A rail shipment might be delayed by a week due to unscheduled maintenance. A cargo vessel might be rerouted to fulfill a more lucrative contract in Brazil, where prices were also spiking due to the global uncertainty. It was a campaign of 1,000 small, plausibly deniable logistical tweaks, just enough to let the U.S. market feel the first pangs of a supply crisis. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. It allowed Ottawa to avoid a direct confrontation while letting the market do the dirty work for them. The price spikes and supply fears gripping American farmers weren't officially Canada's fault. They were the direct consequence of the uncertainty created by Washington's own policies. Behind closed doors, however, the message was anything but subtle. During tense meetings with U.S. officials, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney delivered a clear, unequivocal statement that would become legendary in diplomatic circles. Canada is not for sale. It was a firm declaration of sovereignty, a reminder that Canada's control over its strategic natural resources was absolute and not up for negotiation. This quiet war of attrition created an impossible dilemma on both sides of the border. The White House was trapped in a political vice. Having built its platform on being tough, it couldn't back down from the tariff threats without losing face. Yet pushing forward meant knowingly inflicting severe economic pain on its own rural base, the very farmers who were essential to its political coalition. For Canada, the balancing act was equally delicate. Tightening the valve too much risked triggering a genuine food production crisis in the U.S., which could provoke an even more extreme reaction from Washington and draw international condemnation. Their goal was to create leverage, not famine. Stuck in the middle were the American farmers. They were the hostages in this high-stakes standoff, watching their planting seasons slip away and their input costs soar. Their desperation highlighted a massive long-term failure in U.S. strategic planning. While a new potash mine project in Michigan had recently received a $1.26 billion loan guarantee, it wouldn't be operational until after 2026, and its projected output of 800,000 tons a year was a fraction of the 10 million tons the country needed. There was no plan B. The dependency was total, and Canada knew it. For Canada, and specifically the province of Saskatchewan, the crisis affirmed their status as a global resource superpower. The economic impact was immediate and positive. As U.S. buyers scrambled and global prices surged, Canadian potash producers like Nutrien and Mosaic saw their revenues and profit margins swell. The uncertainty in the U.S. market allowed them to divert shipments to other hungry markets like Brazil and Southeast Asia at premium prices, strengthening their global footprint. The crisis became a powerful marketing tool. Canada could now position itself not just as a reliable supplier, but as the only stable, large-scale supplier in a world of increasing geopolitical risk. This brought a surge of investment and optimism to the province. However, this newfound power came with immense responsibility and pressure. The government in Ottawa and corporate leaders in Saskatoon had to walk a razor's edge. They were acutely aware that their actions directly impacted food security for their largest trading partner. There was no triumphalism, but a sober understanding of the leverage they held. The strategy of weighted silence was a high-wire act. It required constant monitoring and subtle adjustments to ensure they were applying enough pressure to be felt in Washington, but not so much that they caused irreparable damage to the American farmers, who were ultimately their most important customers. It was a demonstration of economic statecraft, turning a defensive position into one of formidable, albeit reluctant, power. In the United States, the impact was not strategic, it was devastatingly personal. The 15% price spike in potash translated directly into higher operating costs for every farmer in the nation. For a family farm in Iowa, this wasn't just a line item on a spreadsheet. It was the difference between profit and loss for the entire year. Reports emerged from agricultural communities across the Corn Belt of farmers making impossible choices. Some were forced to delay planting, hoping for prices to come down, a gamble that risked missing the crucial window for a successful harvest. Others made the painful decision to reduce the amount of fertilizer they used, knowing it would lead to lower yields and less income. The most heartbreaking stories, as described in publications like Farm Progress, involved multi-generational family farms deciding to leave entire fields fallow for the first time in their history, unable to afford the cost of planting. The United States produces only about 400,000 to 500,000 tons of potash domestically, a mere 7 to 8% of its annual demand. There are no strategic reserves to draw upon. The dependency on Canada is not a choice. It's a structural reality. The tariffs, meant to project strength, had instead exposed a critical national vulnerability and left the American farmer bearing the full cost of a trade war they did not start and could not afford to fight. And so, North America stands at a crossroads it never anticipated. A trade dispute over tariffs has exposed a deep and critical dependency at the very heart of the American food system. Canada, by choosing quiet leverage over loud retaliation, demonstrated that true power doesn't always come from the biggest economy, but from controlling a resource that everyone else needs. The United States, in its attempt to assert dominance, instead found itself vulnerable, with its farmers caught in the crossfire. The crisis has forced a painful reevaluation of a relationship once taken for granted. In the race to define the future, will North America win together, or will both sides lose trying to go it alone? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.